Check. Greetings. Hope you had a good lunch. Welcome to the Africa Report debate. My name's Nicholas Norbrook. I'd encourage you to take your seats if you can. The Africa Report is 20 years old this year, so we're obviously legacy media now, which is great. We're also one of Africa's best kept secrets, but that's between me and our marketing department. I'd like to just explain a little bit about how the debate will work and your role in it, because you will have one. We'll be breaking it up into three. There'll be, from the stage, our distinguished panelists in a vigorous exchange. In fact, one of the panelists has asked me to say that this maybe doesn't express his entire opinion, just to give you a taste of some of the fireworks that are to come. And then we will go to some expert witnesses that we have present in the crowd for another 20 minutes, and then we'll open it to you, to the audience. We'll have a vote at the beginning, and we'll have a vote at the end, and we'll see who has won. So I'd like to invite to the stage Patrick Smith, our moderator for this first part, and our glittering panel, Carlos, Arantxa, Beverly, Bright. Please join me. Over to you, Patrick.
I take that off. Hello. Yeah, well, thanks everyone for turning out. And I think this is going to be a really interesting and hopefully mind-changing and even epoch-changing argument. It started off from a kind of informal discussion, actually, with a former French diplomat who, when we were suggesting that the UN and the IMF and the World Bank was in a bit of trouble after the election of Donald Trump last year, she said, "Don't kid yourself. It's over. The West is over in its present form." That's not to say the West is going to crumble, and I don't know whether that's going to produce tears of joy or tears of remorse. It's saying that there's going to be a very new West, and it's probably going to be far more hostile to international collaboration. It's going to be far meaner, and we're already seeing the meanness, because we're seeing it's not just the US government, but it's also all the European governments. I'm very conscious that we have quite a few representatives from the European Union here, but I'm not going to be careful with my words, because we're in a debate, and the European Union is busy transferring budgets that were intended for development finance into budgets to produce arms to kill people. And that is the era we are now in. And against that, we see these new forces in the world. We see the forces of the big economies in the Gulf, $4 trillion of assets under their management. We see whatever people say about the demographics. If China, we see the boom in Chinese technology, the boom in Chinese technological capacity, and a resilient channeling of finance from China. And we see India now growing, I think the fastest big economy in the world, 8%. So I think we're looking at a very new world order. And so at the very least, it's about the West changing into a very different gear. So to argue that out, on my left, I have Arantxa Sanchez, or Arantxa Gonzalez, pardon me, all the way from Paris, Sciences Po, and Bright Simon, all the way from Ghana, Accra. And they are going to caution us about the future of the breakup of the West and what it means for Africa. They're going to send out a few words of warning that be careful what you wish for. Things are going to get a lot more complicated and maybe more dangerous. And on my right, Beverly Ochieng from Dakar, and Carlos Lopez from South Africa via many, many institutions, but you do know the European Union very well, and you are very much at the heart of development finance strategy. And they're going to argue that, yes, the breakup of the West, the change to a new order of the West is a net positive if as far as I understand from what you're saying, if governments across Africa focus on this window of opportunity to change the way they do things, and that means development financing for climate green economies. It means, above all, making the continental free trade area work, and it means making the African Union work in terms of security. So it's a big agenda. So I wanted to start off, first of all, to ask Dr. Carlos Lopez to put the case for the prosecution, that the breakup of the West, the change of the West, is a great liberation moment for Africa if the governments can seize it.
And before you do, forgive me, Dr. Carlos, before you do, we'd like to, first of all, get the opinion of the hall before your words powerfully sway their mind. So if you agree with the proposition that the breakup of the West, or the Western consensus, is a net benefit for Africa, would you please raise your hands? We've got more than a plurality. We've got a definite majority. This is very scientific, as you can see. Thank you. And those who believe not in this proposition, people who believe that it's a net negative for Africa, please put your hand up. Fantastic. And undecideds? Great, smattering of you, very healthy. Great. Take it away, Dr. Carlos.
Well, you know, I was asked to moderate the session with the heads of state that decided on Agenda 2063. And we had a surprise during that assembly, which was the fact that the former Prime Minister of Jamaica, James Patterson, one of the guests and resource persons for the session, decided that instead of starting with a speech, as it's normally the case in such an important occasion, he wanted to play a song. So, and in this assembly of the AU, we got a Bob Marley song, and everybody was kind of surprised with that move. And the song was "So Much Trouble in the World," and you know, a couple of presidents start shaking, then start dancing. After a few minutes, everybody was dancing. And then he said, okay, you know why the diaspora in Africa are the same? It's because we are the only ones that can dance when there is so much trouble in the world. And I think this is sort of a metaphor of the moment that we are living now. So we kind of anticipated that we were on our own. What is crisis for Africa? Crisis is there all the time. You know, this is sort of a normal state of affairs. It's crisis, it's managing crisis. But something changed. And this is why we are here having this debate. One thing that changed is that we realized during the pandemic that we were really on our own. And I think for the first time, the leaders of the continent were obliged, because they had to explain why the vaccines were not coming, why we're not protected like the others, why we could not argue our case in terms of the international negotiations that are taking place. They were on the defensive, and they realized that we are really on our own. And after that, we became, you know what? Something that now is attributable to Mr. Trump, but I'm going to steal from him. We became transactional. We became very transactional. We started really going for whatever is going to serve us. And that is really something that anticipated the moment that we are going to live now. And what is this moment? It's not really the disruption that people are talking about. It's not the disruption of erosion of multilateralism. That was already happening. Protectionism reintroduced on trade. That was already happening. Retreat from climate finance. Come on. It was already happening. No centrality for disarmament discussions. It was already happening. So we can go on with a long list, and we come to the conclusion that what is new is not that type of disruption as people want to believe. ODA was already being eroded. Us being marginalized in trade was already happening. Not having access to capital was already happening. What is new is that now we have a hammer. It's happening in one go. It's happening with a different intensity and with a different speed. That is the real disruption. Not the trend, but the strength. And this strength is like a wake-up call. If Africa does not realize that this world is finally gone as we know it, there will be no more win-win trade. There will be no more easy access to capital. The centrality of ODA in our discussions doesn't make any sense. The institutions that are used to have become legacy institutions. They have processes and instruments that don't work anymore. If we don't realize that, we are not understanding that there is a rise of some, and that rise of some comes with the cost of the others going down. That's why we have to really accept that when it comes to the role of Africa in relation to geopolitical changes, definitely the West is over.
Right. Thanks for the opening comments. Can I turn now to Arantxa and Gonzalez and ask you to put the case against Carlos's argument about where we are, because you're now at Sciences Po in Paris, I believe, but you've been at the heart of Western institutions, the European Union, for some time. Could you please put the case, as succinctly as Carlos did, for why we should be very wary about what's happening and the implications for Africa?
Let me first tell you that the era of colonialism is over. And we have to make sure that we do not fall into the era of neo-colonialism. What do I mean by that? Africa does not need to wait for the breakup of the West in order to take control of its future. I would argue that Africa has what it takes to take Africa's future in its own hands, and that the breakup of the West is going to create a very turbulent world in which it will have to operate. More turbulent, and here I very much agree with Carlos, because there is a perfect storm that is hitting Africa in a very harsh way. So I do think that the breakup of the West and the turbulence that is creating is very bad news for Africa. First, it means that less attention would be given to issues that matter for Africa and where Africa and the West need to work together. Does anyone believe that we're going to solve the crisis of climate change by the West broken in pieces on one side and Africa at the other side? No. These are global public goods that we need to work to protect together. Does anyone believe that the breakup of the West is going to be good for ensuring financial stability in the world? So I don't think that the environment would be good for Africa. But let me be a bit tougher. Yes, the international order where we live is flawed. It had many shortcomings. It was in need of repair before the breakup of the West. But the question is a world of dog eat dog better for Africa? Really? So what's the difference between a US or an EU oligarch and a Russian or a Chinese oligarch? What is the difference between a religious supremacist in the West and a religious supremacist in the South? No, the breakup of the West creates even more problems for the African continent, which is why I think we should not rejoice about that.
Thank you. Brilliantly put. Beverly, you've now, battle has been joined. Why are you drinking Bissap with the occasional glass of Dakar wine in celebration of the breakup of the West?
I think there's sometimes a bit of a misconception that the breakup of the West necessarily means that Russia or China will get an easy foothold on the continent. And I think one of the things that Carlos and I have been talking about is how African institutions need to build a sense of resilience so that they can leverage, irrespective of which partner is approaching them, whether it's the West, whether it's China, whether it's Russia. There has been a bit of momentum. Some of it has been, mishandled. And I think pointing out to COVID-19, pointing out to the conflict in Ukraine, and the fact that Africa continues to fall on the wayside means that there needs to be a reflection inwards on geopolitical realignments, on how to leverage on internal institutions and protocols. The Africa Free Trade Agreement has been brought up a lot, and it took a very long time for many countries to sign on. But the positive projections are, if it is fully implemented in the next 2 decades, then we have intra-African trade increasing by about 35%. If you think about the visa openness index, yes, very few countries are very open to even other African nationals. It's quite sad. I can't go into Togo as easily as I'd like to. I can't go into Ethiopia sometimes as easily as I'd want to. But I think there is some positive thinking around being able to ensure that there's that interconnectivity among Africans themselves to be able to open up trade, to even exchange socially and politically, and to be able to use that to improve our knowledge and our navigation within the continent. And then you think about even Agenda 2063, which the broader picture is that Africa should be able to have a strong standing on the international scene so that it can leverage on various developments, whether it's technology, because right now it's a very extractive relationship, post-colonialism, neo-colonialism. It's still us inviting people to take our resources without necessarily having to pass on expertise or technical knowledge. So I think that's the point of reflection for African countries now. It's when we have other parties coming into the continent, are they passing on that knowledge? Are they developing technology? Are they supporting local or pan-African climate initiatives? And then using that to then weigh with the West when we're at the table at the UN Security Council, the WTO, the G20, to then say, this is what we have, we're implementing, and we want to be able to weigh the same in these very long-standing establishment institutions. There is some headway. Now we have South Africa and the African Union as part of the G20, and that's taken years to come into place. We're still fighting to have a space in the UN Security Council because the majority of conflicts are on the continent, but we don't get to weigh around them on a plenary such as that. So I think it's about not necessarily just turning to another geopolitical power, but it's about being able to leverage our institutions and to be able to build institutional and technical capacity to then say that Africa is competent and capable of navigating an uncertain geopolitical future.
Thanks, Beverly. Brilliant. She's taking up the gauntlet with you, Bright, and you are now the defender of the be careful what you wish for lobby. And I wanted one particularly because you do a lot on the commercial world, capital markets and so on. If you might be able to mention something about what the changes in the West private sector and the concentration of capital in the West and what that means for Africa. So as you say, we should be wary of the West breaking up and what that means for Africa and how those changes in the Western corporate world are going to affect Africa.
Thank you, Patrick. I think, though, that this wonderful audience has not been very kind to our debating opponents. We should be giving them a standing ovation by now, because the display of naivety is unbelievable. It's incredible. And yet you haven't done that. First of all, we have to start off by analyzing what is it that has caused this breakup of the West. It hasn't happened organically. There is somebody who is moving to the White House and has a particular agenda that many people have mistaken for isolationism, but it's actually a new consolidated form of mercantilism, of a new realpolitik of control by doing whatever he wants. And moving America to doing whatever he wants is exactly what my colleague here has described. It's a new world of chaos, and it's a new world of anarchy. Now, in that new world of anarchy, are you seriously saying that Africa is positioned to prevail? Let me give you a bit of history. It's called the Suez Crisis. In the 1950s, Egypt decided that it controlled the Suez Canal because it's in its territory, and that it will review rates and do everything that sovereign powers can do. Israel said he didn't like it. France and Britain teamed up together and invaded Egypt. It took the United States and Russia to rein in France and Britain. That created a fascinating reality. Europe was immediately told that it cannot exercise an imperialistic foreign policy without America's tutelage and without America's consent. This was the underlying structure of the transatlantic alliance, in which Europe sacrificed its ability to project hard power in the world, came under the American nuclear umbrella, and then through its soft power exercise, implemented constraints on American power itself. So the transatlantic alliance is a balance of European soft power and American hard power. Removing or allowing that to shatter creates an incredible removal of restraint in the world of geopolitics. We seriously want a rearming Europe again? Go back to history. That is the interwar years between the First and the Second World War. Look at the pace at which Germany overtook the Anglo-Saxon world in the production of steel, armaments, and the rest of it. You really want to reactivate the Ruhr Valley? What that will mean is an industrial policy of this scale that will ensure that late industrialization societies like Africa cannot rely on an export-led strategy that the South Asians and others used to industrialize. We're already suffering from China and the others through their oversupply, making it very difficult for us to export. Europe deciding to implement industrial policy now because it needs to rearm and compete with the United States is the final straw that will break the camel's back. Let me give you 4 other reasons why you don't want Europe and America to abandon the mutual restraint ideology. 1, global cooperation on illicit financial flows only works because the West cooperates. Try as an African country trying to get UAE, Russia, or China to give you stolen assets back. Try that as Chad or Ghana or Zambia. The only reason why Caribbean tax havens will listen to anything at all because the West cooperates and the West has the power to leverage. What is Africa's biggest problem now? Africa's biggest problem is that it's a net exporter of capital involuntarily. That capital that comes from multinational corporations not paying the right amount of tax, that capital that comes from politicians stealing money and putting them in tax savings, all of that money far exceeds anything we've talked about, whether it's in terms of development aid or climate finance, etc. The only way to get that money back, the only way to ensure that that money that leaks out stops, is cooperation with the West in its current form. The new West in which Europe competes with America and therefore can't collaborate on things like that will completely damage efforts to recover that capital and restore that back into the economy. On the area of carbon markets, climate finance, and the rest of it, what is Africa's biggest asset? Sequestration capacity. We have forests that can hold billions of dollars of avoided carbon emissions. But that only works if the compliance markets in Europe allow the interchange under Article 6.4 in the Paris Agreement. Why? Because Europe controls 90% of the compliant markets. Without cooperation, forget it. In a world in which unbridled capitalism means that Europe has to compete with America, what is the base of Europe restraining its industry through climate restraints? No. So the compliance markets will fall. That $900 billion is no longer available for Africa to leverage the Congo and the rest for. And the last point we will make is that Europe's regulatory superpower status, which serves as a constraint on America, allows Africa to intervene in technological sectors such as AI, where we are really behind. Why? Because Europe will slow down America enough for us to catch up by introducing privacy regulations, by introducing regulations that prevent harm, etc. It forces American companies to be much more cautious in the way that they deploy this AI. Take that away, and you're going to have unbridled capitalism, incredible amounts of competition, leads to a pace of technology transformation that consigns Africa to the backwaters forever. Thank you.
Wow. Right. Well, absolutely right. You've set the cat among the pigeons. Can we, Carlos, you're looking very, very suspicious of this. It sounds like an ambush almost. But 3 points. Can you, because actually all the rights major points are areas of your own expertise, which makes it very interesting. Illicit financial flows. He's saying that, you know, the end of the West, forget it, folks. You know, China and the UAE aren't going to give you back your stolen money. You know, forget that. I wonder if actually the West is actually giving Africa back its stolen money at the moment. I don't see much of it, but anyway, I'd like, yeah, Abacha. I don't know where he is at the moment, but there's that. The climate sequestration and the management of these carbon credits. I think the European Union is controlling all that. And yeah, I mean, I think the weakening of European regulations, the fight with a sort of so-called over-regulated Europe with a sort of free enterprise US, isn't that just going to be disaster for Africa, and it's going to make things worse?
I think Bright is confusing his name with his wish.
Oh dear.
Because let's look at it. You know, his premise is that, you know, you shouldn't want the break between the US and Europe. Nobody wants it. It's just happening, period. Now, why are we going to say I'm in favor or not of that breakup? No, it's happening. Let's wake up. You know, it's not something that we are debating here. Second, he says that, you know, we should not, you know, wish for a deregulated world in some sorts, because we have now, you know, sort of a player in the name of the US administration that is undermining the rules-based system. That's more or less what he's saying. The rules-based system has been undermined for quite some time. But we had this idea that we had consensus. What was that consensus? We'll go to a COP, let's say, and we'll negotiate every paragraph, every comma, you know, and we'll be there until the meeting finishes, and we'll still negotiating the commas and the paragraphs. And then eventually we say, yes, we won, because there is a declaration. And that declaration produced what? Nothing. And this is not just COP. This is WTO. This is every single front where this rules-based system was thinking that progress was being made. Yes, it was progress. It was consensus of language, not of implementation. So now, if that is the case, then, you know, are we going to enter into a phase where we don't have colonialism but neocolonialism? Arantxa, please. I mean, give me a break. I mean, neocolonialism has been with us for all this time and is not going to go away, because it's premised on a couple of theories that are being infused in every policy that we are supposed to implement. The first of which is the theory of comparative advantages. The way it has been infused in Africa is basically static. Oh, you were, during the colonial times, exporters of commodities without value addition. What are we today? The same. 6 decades of development. That's what they produced. In the structural reality of the African economies, that is the reality. Now, looking into the future, you spoke about tech, Bright. Okay. Well, tech for me is about the skewed concentration of capacity that is going to be in the hands of a very few, most American-based. I say with, you know, sort of a smile, American-based, because if you look into the CEOs of each one of these companies, not a single one was born in America, but it's American-based. So it's about the jurisdiction. It's about what that jurisdiction offers. But look, the reality is going to be AI stealing intellectual property, imploding intellectual property regimes, not applying anymore the principle that you are going to produce where is the fastest, the quickest, and the best, or the cheapest. You are going to be in a world where it's about us, selfish, and for that world, Africa needs to be transactional. It's not about defending the West, neither about defending China, or neither about defending Russia. It's about defending Africa. And to defend Africa is about changing completely the configuration of the discussion. So I don't care whether, the monies of some of the extractive industries that are going to find their places in some of the capitals in Europe or the US is going to be affected by this change. What I care is about building an African architecture that financially is going to retain our savings in the continent. That's what I care.
Well, Arantxa, first of all, the neo-colonial point that Carlos just made, but the bigger point of your side of the argument is, I guess, in my mind, is if you've got this great agglomeration of global power in the West, and it's beginning to sort of shatter and split off in different, what should be Africa's response? Should African states be, well, try and keep it together, guys. Let's try and keep the Bretton Woods system going. Let's try to keep the post-World War II order sort of more or less in train. The UN system needs a bit of adjustment, but nothing too radical. I mean, what's going to be the response if, as you say, the wholesale breakup of the West into a hugely transactional US and a kind of, regulatory Europe is going to be terrible for Africa. What should African governments be doing?
So Carlos is very eloquent, and he tells us that Africa has to choose Africa. And my question is, what is Africa waiting for? Does Africa need to wait for the breakup of the West to do that? What's holding Africa back? What is holding Africa doing its own continental free trade agreement and changing the patterns of international trade and changing the manner in which its finances work and changing the architecture of finance to make sure that the richness that this continent has remains in this continent? So what are you waiting for, Carlos?
Colonialism.
Oh. Colonialism stopped the day you decided to negotiate very ably an African continental free trade agreement. You took this into your hands, and it was an amazing moment of Africa choosing Africa. But what has happened since? How many barriers still remain to intra-Africa trade? And who has to dismantle those barriers? Africa. Then on climate change, you say it's all about commas. You call commas what I call the Paris Climate Agreement. Thank goodness we have the Paris Climate Agreement. Thanks to the Paris Climate Agreement, those that are large emitters, thus is not the case of Africa. Africa is 2% of emissions. But we need all the other emitters to reduce their emissions. What you call commas, I call commitments to reduce emissions so that this continent can survive. So thanks to this Paris Climate Agreement, we can agree that it's far from perfect, but thanks to that, countries have committed to reduce emissions, and now we have a mechanism to check that they are doing it, that the EU is doing it, actually is doing it. By 2030, it would have done what it says it would do, that America is doing it, that China, that is 32% of emissions, is doing it. Final point, we can argue that the international trading system is not perfect. It's not. It needs reform, it does. But tell me one place where Africa will win a case, a dispute against mighty US if it's not in the World Trade Organization. Tell me of a place that will discipline the subsidies that rich countries give to fish subsidies that deplete the African oceans if it is not in the World Trade Organization. So yeah, the world is imperfect, but it's better off, in my view, something imperfect is better off than something where it's a zero-sum world.
Thanks. Right. Thank you, audience. You're really getting into the spirit of it. Beverly, yeah, the few pointers laid down by Arantxa there. Perhaps on the WTO issue, in the general, the UN system. I I mean, is the UN system terminally broken, and should we just reinvent it? And that's to Africa's advantage to seize this moment. Or we got to be really, really careful about deconstructing, IMF, World Bank, UN, UNIDO, UNDP, and all that stuff. Which angle do you approach it from?
I think right now most countries are trying to pursue reform systems, especially with establishment institutions. One, because they still do heavily depend on them. But even in the thinking about, what is stopping African countries from being more self-reliant, yes, it is Africans themselves. Part of it is a leadership issue. There's a lot of pressure coming, especially from, I suppose, younger people who want more responsive leadership, who want leaders that are thinking about their social welfare, about their education, about their representation. And that also boils down to questions about what are the systems of dependency that have constantly put African countries at a disadvantage. The IMF is making quite a big comeback in various countries, Kenya, there's Senegal, there's countries like Ghana and so on. And some of us are from the generation just after the structural adjustment programs. I remember seeing retrenchment and families that were losing their livelihoods because governments had to make unpopular decisions to be able to meet the demands of Bretton Woods institutions in order to be able to support the economy, broadly speaking. But I think over the years, beyond just calling for reforms, there have been some proactive steps and efforts by, say, the African Union, like we mentioned, Agenda 2063, the Africa Free Trade Agreement, changing mobility for Africans across the continent. That will take a very long time, of course. Then there's been the calls for African countries to be better represented in the UN. When the Ukraine invasion happened, there was a lot of weight towards how many African countries were either voting for or against Russia, and how that was being weighed to make assumptions about their geopolitical alignments. Many countries actually abstained because on principle, many countries prefer negotiations through crisis as opposed to just having a yes or no, which would shut down any sort of dialogue. That's a sort of, it feels like political exclusion to make an assumption about why African countries voted as they did. They do have their own internal systems through which they mediate conflict. And sometimes establishment institutions do not take that fully into consideration. So in the end, it's not just as simple as, the West breaking up is necessarily a bad thing. We do not know if some of these agreements will be seen through to fruition, especially now that we're seeing a more unreliable West with the US aid being withdrawn, for instance. We're seeing countries diversify or move their financing away from development towards defense. And we're seeing that European countries and even the US are more inward looking. And perhaps that's an opportunity for us to realign what we have institutionally to build it so that it actually does work for Africans, reflect on leadership, reflect on our internal, the Africa Peace and Security Commission, for instance, being more responsive towards conflicts, being able to hold countries to account, and of course, whether African leaders are willing to let themselves be held to account to that extent.
But do you think it's worth African states trying to make the UN system work? Or are you going to, say this is a moment for crisis, the old Western alliance is over, multilateralism is dead, so let's don't use our energies on something else, maybe the African Union, Peace and Security Council, and so on? Or do you think African states should start lobbying and push the UN seriously?
I'd say because broadly speaking, the observation has been that Africa is falling off of the agenda, even when they do come up with peace and security initiatives. Like when the Ukraine war broke out, there was a delegation that did go both to Russia and Ukraine. It wasn't taken as seriously as, say, right now the negotiations that the US is trying to back. So I think because sometimes it feels like wasted energy, then it might be much more fruitful to then look at internal institutions and empower them instead.
So Africa should become much more continental-centric, Pan-Africanist in its diplomacy.
I suppose they should think about how to resolve internal crisis, then leverage that when operating with external actors.
Right. What about that? Should Africa just sort of give up on the international system? It's not fit for purpose. It's outdated. Nothing in it for Africa. Africa should focus on stuff like free trade area, African Union peacekeeping, etc., etc.
So let me
what do you say to that?
React to Professor Lopez for a minute. Now, the thing with grand academics is that sometimes, when they are in the weeds of the academic theories and the rest, they forget what the actual topic is. we did not come here to lament the collapse of the West, right? Nor did we come here to fix the West. The question is, will the breakup of the West be good or bad for Africa? Now, it's a very similar debate to the 1991 situation. Will the end of the Cold War be good or bad for Africa? And if you don't answer correctly, you don't have the strategic foresight to come up with the right solutions looking into the future. That's what we are facing here. If we don't predict properly whether the breakup of the West will be bad or good for Africa, then our strategic foresight will not be as efficient, will not be as far-seeing, and will definitely not be as transformative enough so that we can come up with the right counter and remedies to what will transpire. That is the debate. So our position on this side is that the breakup of the West will foment unbelievable chaos. It will foment significant amounts of anarchy, and therefore Africa's response must necessarily take into account that reality. Some of the things we definitely must do is what has been said. We have to assume that some of the established patterns that we have operated upon no longer apply. An example will definitely be the case that when you think about climate finance and you do your national determined contributions and the like of it, in the past you assumed a certain rules-based order, Paris 6.4 and others that you were operating within. Our argument is that that no longer applies in many instances. So that realpolitik requires you to rethink some of your assumptions about the world order. The transformation of a world order requires incredible amounts of foresight. Getting it right, therefore, matters. And that's the point of this debate. Trying to predict whether the breakup of the West will be good or bad for Africa, and getting it right in that prediction will shape the policies that we implement. If we think, oh, it's going to be great, it's going to be a net benefit, etc., we'll make certain policies. If we think it will be a net negative, we'll make certain other policies. That is the debate. So we, on this side, claiming that this will be really bad for Africa, are saying that the nature of our strategies for resilience must look back into history and attempt to craft remedies that reflect an anarchic world. Before the Peace of Westphalia, before Cold War, before the Treaty of Augsburg, these are historical patterns in the world. Many people don't know that the United States was at a Berlin conference when the world was being partitioned. There was no transatlantic alliance then. That shaped how the US approached those negotiations. Many people here may not know that the US refused to sign that treaty because its competitive interests were not met, even though it recognizes the claim of Leopold to Congo, etc. Now, if you know that and your history is sharp enough, you understand that an anarchic world requires a different kind of realpolitik. The question is, do our leaders in Africa have what it takes to respond to that realpolitik? And the starting point is recognizing the emergence of an anarchic world. That is our point of debate.
And how do they react to that? Do they stay engaged in the system, or do they go continental? Just say, forget it.
I mean, certainly some of the things like Arantxa said, we should be doing anyway, whether the West is breaking up or not. We should look at those specific areas where the breakup of the West creates particular challenges. And an example would be the current situation in the Congo, where we now have a new dynamic of a country going to the United States, holding its critical minerals resource and saying, here is my critical mineral resource, America, help me out. That is what you see in an anarchic world. It's a world that the AU was not made for. It's a world that the AU cannot comprehend. And I'm saying that it requires us to rethink the assumptions. Because if you now know that that's what is going to happen, then we have to ask, what kind of club do you create for defense alliances? Turkey, UAE, all of them are signing different defense pacts, completely uncoordinated around the continent. Because our traditional posture has been to deal with the West to control the world. That doesn't apply anymore. So we must now look at emerging powers and operate on a club basis and say plurilateral mechanisms for dealing with the world are the only reality. So the AU must invite Turkey, UAE, all of these people that are playing roles in Sudan and the rest to the table, forgetting that this can be done to the UN Security Council, because the UN Security Council is broken. That mindset does not emerge until you first accept the reality of an anarchic world. And that is the point we are making.
But you're in danger of agreeing with Carlos, I think, right?
No, we're not. No, there's a big difference. There's a big difference between saying that Africa needs to be strong and look inward and assert its regional sovereignty, And because of this or that, our argument is that the breakup of the West precipitates particular sets of challenges that are not there if the West work together. Those new challenges require different strategies.
So Africa must engage in the international system and actually try to help the West behave better.
That's part of
that would be
partly. But when the West is not coherent anymore, then you have to use plurilateral methods. You have to find ways in which you engage parties that in the past the West acted as an intermediary to influence. You can't use the West as an intermediary anymore because the West is no longer cohesive. This is a very different argument from what they are making.
Beverly?
Yeah,
Is it?
it feels like what I was saying. I mean, I did point out the fact that when we felt that all the peace initiatives were not, or Ukraine, Russia were not working, then we did actually have an African mediation. It's just that it may have felt slightly misplaced considering all the conflicts, but it does demonstrate, and I think that war and the voting in the UN did demonstrate there's a lot of leverage for African countries, and that leverage can be replicated, whether it's in the economy, whether it's technology, whether it's human capital. Many times the negotiations tend to be at a disadvantage to African countries, whereby we still reinforce colonialism, exploitation. But I think where we're moving, and it's not just the DR Congo, here are minerals, help us with guns, but it's kind of when you're now thinking of the more deeper points around why are you coming to this region, what are you doing? And it's not necessarily just, there's always the criticism again when African countries go to the joint summits like the Russia-Africa Summit, the US-Africa Summit. They haven't quite had their own discussion about what do we want to leverage in our agreements. And of course, we all have Africa is not a country. No, it's not a country, but I suppose having that strength as a big institution like the AU, the way the EU can be one, is one way of going about it.
I have to respond to Brian.
Right. If I let Brian speak now, then you'll have even more to respond to. Okay. Carlos. He wants you to speak now. So it's setting up another ambush for you.
You see, Bright is nostalgic of the G7 dinner where, there are assigned seats, predictable menu, everybody knows what is going to come out and everything is fine. That old order is over. He says itself is broken here, it's broken there. And then you have Arantxa say, okay, but Paris Agreement has actually reduced, it isn't reduced anything. We are in overshoot period. So all of this thing is just nostalgic moves. We need a bit of music to go with it, but fine if you want to believe it. The reality is very different. The reality is one where we are actually facing a completely unpredictable world and where, yes, true, we have weaponized uncertainty. Now, weaponizing uncertainty is not just because we have Mr. Trump in the US presidency. It's because of the rise of the rest. That's the problem. It's because this asymmetry that existed with rules is now being challenged by new players. And of course, actually, they are challenging it by playing by the rules, which is the paradox. The reason we don't want to maintain the rules is because China is taking advantage of those rules. So let's disrupt it. That's the reason. We are basically boxing Africa as if it had a debt problem, when in fact Africa has an access to capital problem. If you have the least access to capital, you pay the highest interest rate. What do you expect? So you want to buy a house, Bright? I want to buy a house. You pay 11%, I pay 0. Which is going to get the best house? And which is going to be the one benefiting from the situation as it is? That world is the reason why we are in this asymmetric situation. It's not just our making. Yes, of course, we have a lot of responsibilities and we have to exercise agency. But the main problem is fundamentally the way the regulations work, and they didn't work for us. It's not a world that was made for us to get out of the commodity dependency. When you talk about any African country, the first thing that people say is, do they have diamonds? Do they have copper? I mean, what is this? I hope you like chocolate, Bright. Because if you like chocolate, you of course know. You of course know because where you are. You of course know that 96% of that value chain of cocoa is not staying in Africa. And when was this established this way? long ago. When is it changing? I don't know. But this is the moment for policy space.
Right. Rise of the rest.
So
Good or bad?
the challenge with Professor Lopez's framing of the world is that he constantly makes the perfect the enemy of the good. So currently things are bad. What should we do? Light the fire. Pour more deep fuel onto the fire. Let the West rapture and let us have, a kind of competition that the world has never seen before, like in the interwar years between Germany and the United States. Let's have rearmament of Europe again. That kind of world will not benefit Africa. The truth is, as I've tried to explain, if this anarchic world is going to emerge, Africans must predict it rightly. And by predicting it rightly, they must design policies that are truly responsive. One of the things that we've done for many decades, which he will not deny, is that we in Africa have outsourced a lot of standards development around the world to the notion of a coherent West. We don't question it too much because there seems to be the case that Europe counterbalances America enough that we don't look too closely. I'll give you very practical examples because now I'm sounding esoteric. I'm sounding like Professor Lopez. But very practically, think of internet policy. How many of us pay attention to the ITU processes in which things like IPv6 and things like that emerge? Very few African policymakers bother. A lot of that work is done in forums in which most of the players are Europe and America going at each other, trying to balance it out. A lot of the standards you see in biotech go something like this. The Americans go GMO all the way, and the Europeans go no, precautionary principle. And then somewhere in the middle, there is a kind of biotech policy that works for the world. That cohesion is going to be broken apart. We can no longer outsource the development of global standards, whether in biotech, in nanotech, in artificial intelligence, in so many of these areas, to the notion of a coherent West. Why? Because of mercantilism. Because of the fact that nationalism is being introduced into every facet of global life. Everything is going to be competitive. So standards that used to be primarily collaborative will now be competitive. If Africans predict this rightly, then Africans all of a sudden have to say, who are our voices in international standard setting forums like the ITU, like the World Meteorological Organization, etc. Space, seabed. How many African voices? Mention a single African expert on space politics. I dare you. Mention a single African expert on seabed politics. I dare you. Why have we done that? Because we've outsourced it to the West. Why not? Because the West in those days was relatively benign because of competition between Europe and America, leading to restraints. Europe listening to America, America listening to Europe, and it led to some kind of restraint. Not unbridled capitalism taking over space or the Arctic or the seabed. My argument is that if that is going away, then we better be prepared. Because now it means that in all of those forums, we need African experts there championing the AU position on the seabed, in space, in AI, in nanotech, in biotech. We don't. If we call it wrongly, we will not. That's the nature of the debate.
Right. Thanks.
Thank you for agreeing with this side.
Well, I think we're having a danger of too much agreement. So into that forum marches Nick Norbrook, and he's going to interview some other experts in the audience who are going to give their competing arguments for and against the motion. Over to you, Nick.
It's been quite a full contact sport this afternoon. As we don't pay them their bonuses unless minds are changed, can you just tell me, has anyone's mind been changed yet? One. You're going to have to work harder. There's one mind changed. We're not paying the bonus. And another, apparently. So in this sequence, we will be talking to some expert witnesses who can let us know their perspectives on this debate. Each side will be able to ask them a question if they wish. They don't have to. And we will start with His Excellency, former President of Senegal, Macky Sall. We're very pleased is with us. He will be answering in the French language. If you require translation, our helpful friends up here will be able to sort you out. Si vous pourriez aider les gens avec une main levée. Merci. Monsieur le Président, merci d'être venu. Bienvenue au Africa Report Debate. Le Sénégal, comme beaucoup d'autres pays en Afrique de l'Ouest, sur tout le continent, a souffert le même problème. Comment faire avec, par exemple, dans les télécoms, des technologies chinoises et les Américains qui disent il ne faut pas. Ou bien l'Union européenne et la Chine qui font la compétition pour tous les poissons sur le rivage. Comment le Sénégal a pu gérer ces pressions? Je vous laisse avec cette question. Ensuite, les deux panélistes vont vous poser des questions.
Merci beaucoup. Thank you very much. Je ne suis pas expert. Je crois que le panel qui vient de se dérouler a montré des visions prospectives avec beaucoup d'éclat. Je salue tous les panélistes. Je vais plutôt parler évidemment du même sujet, mais sous l'angle pratique de l'exercice du pouvoir, faisant face justement à toutes ces pressions dont il a parlé, parce que l'Afrique, si nous voulons comprendre d'où elle est venue, pour pouvoir bâtir une perspective du futur, on ne peut pas négliger les causes de la situation actuelle de l'Afrique. On ne peut pas simplement parler des symptômes sans remonter aux causes de la maladie. Tantôt, j'ai entendu quelqu'un rappeler Berlin, le congrès de 1885, où vraiment l'avenir de l'Afrique a été tracé à la règle. Et la partition faite par les puissances coloniales. Et nous sommes partis depuis Berlin 1885 jusqu'aux indépendances, aux différentes indépendances du continent, parfois dans la douleur. On a vu les mouvements de libération, le mouvement de la décolonisation, la participation de l'Afrique dans la Première Guerre mondiale, dans la Seconde Guerre mondiale, et finalement l'accès aux indépendances. Et quand l'Afrique est venue à l'indépendance, voyant la réalité des frontières, elle a dit, si nous nous amusons à remettre en cause ces partages, bien qu'ils soient imparfaits, scélérates, nous allons plonger dans une nouvelle perspective de guerre interminable entre les États. Donc, gardons les frontières telles qu'elles sont. Ça a été le consensus dès la création de l'Organisation de l'Unité africaine, devenue l'Union africaine. C'est pourquoi vous voyez toutes ces incohérences. Je prends l'exemple du Sénégal et de la Gambie, deux pays qui en réalité sont un seul. Même peuple, même ethnie, même langue. Mais du fait du partage, les Français ont donné une part aux Anglais là-bas, une petite bande. Et ailleurs, on leur a donné également une bande en compensation. Ceux-là sont anglophones, les autres sont francophones, des systèmes politiques totalement opposés. Voilà véritablement l'héritage qui a été donné aux Africains lorsqu'ils ont pris leur indépendance. L'autre héritage le plus difficile a été l'Organisation des Nations Unies à partir de 1946, au lendemain de la Seconde Guerre mondiale. Ils étaient 53 États à organiser cette ONU qui était utile, qui est toujours utile, qu'il faut renforcer et fortifier, mais avec des règles qui donnaient la part belle aux vainqueurs de la Seconde Guerre mondiale. Ils avaient le droit de veto, les autres n'en avaient pas. Ils avaient la répartition des responsabilités dans l'organisation. Et aujourd'hui, nous sommes 193 États, contre 53 à la création. Quelle est la part de ces États qui sont venus après les indépendances? C'est une portion congrue. Pas de pouvoir de vote au Conseil de sécurité, pas de membres permanents. C'est pareil pour les institutions de Bretton Woods. On ne comptait pas puisqu'on n'était pas autour de la table. Et ce sont ces règles, malheureusement, d'il y a 80 ans qui continuent à gouverner le monde d'aujourd'hui. Voilà pourquoi, Anka, j'ai beaucoup apprécié. Mais l'Afrique veut se libérer. L'Afrique essaie de se libérer. Mais elle est bloquée par le système multilatéral tel qu'il est aujourd'hui. Et c'est pourquoi nous plaidons pour la réforme de l'architecture financière internationale. Nous plaidons pour la réforme du Conseil de sécurité. Nous plaidons pour plus d'inclusivité dans le système multilatéral. Alors, En plus, on nous fait le procès. Oui, pourquoi l'Afrique se donne à la Chine? Moi, j'ai vécu des exemples très particuliers. La Chine, jusqu'au moment où je vous parle, est le seul pays ou le seul partenaire, j'allais dire, bilatéral, qui accepte de trouver l'Afrique dans ses choix de développement infrastructurel. Parce que ça demande beaucoup de capitaux. Le chemin de fer, combien de réunions nous avons fait avec nos partenaires de l'Union européenne? Ils ont refusé même d'envisager la construction de chemins de fer. Je me rappelle de discussions très dures que j'avais avec un certain commissaire européen à l'époque. Il ne pouvait pas envisager la construction d'un chemin de fer. Ce n'était pas urgent, ce n'était pas important. Donc, le seul pays qui accepte d'investir avec nous sur l'infrastructure de développement, c'était la Chine. Les autres, ils étaient sur le software. Ou alors, ils te parlent de climat. Alors que le climat, ce n'est pas les Africains qui sont à l'origine de la pollution mondiale. Voilà le problème. Il est aussi simple. J'ai dit à nos partenaires de l'Ouest, mais si vous faites comme la Chine, vous nous trouvez dans nos schémas de développement. Parce que quand nous sommes assez matures pour savoir ce qu'il nous faut pour faire avancer nos pays et pour donner du progrès à nos populations. L'Afrique, c'est un continent de 30 millions de kilomètres carrés qu'il faut bâtir. Donc, il faut des routes, il faut du chemin de fer, il faut des centrales électriques. Mais on ne peut pas le faire avec ce qu'on nous donne comme recette sur le climat. Hein, il faut faire du renouvelable. Où est-ce qu'on a vu dans le monde le renouvelable seul faire le développement de l'électricité? Ça n'existe pas. C'est une énergie qui vient en appoint, qui vient écrêter les demandes de puissance. Mais il vous faut une énergie de base. L'Europe s'est bâtie, s'est construite sur la base du charbon, puis du pétrole. Les États-Unis, c'est pareil. La Chine, c'est pareil. Quand on veut refuser à l'Afrique ce même chemin de développement, en nous orientant vers les énergies renouvelables. Encore que nous faisons plus de renouvelables que ces pays. Nous en faisons plus et à nos frais. Donc, vraiment, je pense que la question, elle est peut-être pas bien posée à mon avis, parce que l'Afrique n'a pas à choisir. L'Afrique ne peut pas faire de l'exclusion. Et c'est ce qu'on nous demande de faire. Il n'est pas question que vous soyez avec la Chine, sinon nous, on retient nos ressources. Alors que tout ce que vous dites cela traite avec la Chine. L'Afrique ne peut pas aussi accepter l'exclusivité. C'est-à-dire vous n'êtes marié qu'à nous exclusivement, pendant que vous avez plusieurs autres amours. Ce n'est pas possible. Donc, pas d'exclusion, pas d'exclusivité, mais l'Afrique, c'est pourquoi moi je ne suis pas dans ce discours qui consiste à dire l'Occident ceci, l'Occident cela, ou l'Orient ceci, ou l'Orient cela. Nous devons chercher le meilleur avec n'importe quel partenaire, qu'il soit de l'Ouest ou de l'Est. Parce que nous sommes dans la globalisation, nous devons regarder ce qui nous arrange en fin de compte. Donc qu'on soit avec la Chine, l'Occident ou je ne sais qui d'autre, ou la Russie, mais pourvu que nous tirions nos épingles du jeu, notre épingle du jeu. Et bien des pays, je les ai vus forcés et contraints d'aller vers la Russie. C'est le cas par exemple de la République centrafricaine. Un pays qui est attaqué par le terrorisme, on te fait un embargo sur les armes. Vous ne pouvez pas vous armer. Comment vous allez faire? Et la Russie à côté vous dit, moi je vous envoie les armes et les mercenaires. Qu'est-ce que vous allez faire? Donc il faut aussi que les gens s'interrogent sur les pratiques, sur les sanctions qui sont prises tous azimuts. Voilà, sans que cela ne soit forcément dans l'intérêt même de ceux-là qui prennent les sanctions. Et pour terminer, on a le cas de la Libye, un cas difficile. Un pays qui était stable. Quoi qu'on puisse dire, Kadhafi, il est comme il est, mais il tenait un pays pendant 40 ans, un pays qui était en développement, qui avait des ressources. Aujourd'hui, avec l'intervention de l'OTAN, qu'est-ce qui s'est passé? Le pays est défait, le pays est failli. Et le terrorisme est passé par la Libye pour rentrer dans le Sahel. Aujourd'hui, tout le Sahel est infesté. Et l'Afrique est aujourd'hui devenue, par la force des choses, le ventre mou du terrorisme international, sans qu'il y ait les réponses globales, comme ça a été le cas au Levant, lorsque l'État islamique était là, comme ça a été le cas dans les coalitions en Afghanistan, où on a mobilisé des milliers de milliards pour essayer de vaincre le terrorisme avec les résultats qu'on connaît. Mais ici, Où est la coalition multinationale? Où sont les moyens pour aider les pays africains à faire face à ce danger? Donc, au moment où nous avons des problèmes de famine, de maladies, de développement, comme je l'ai dit, il faut en même temps lutter contre le terrorisme. Et il faut lutter contre tout cela. Donc, je crois que nous devons travailler la main dans un partenariat gagnant-gagnant. Dans un partenariat gagnant-gagnant. Moi, je ne rejette pas l'Europe, mais je rejette le partenariat tel qu'il est. Il faut qu'il soit rénové. Il faut qu'il soit un partenariat qui tienne compte, nous, de nos choix de développement et qui tienne compte de nos réalités. Plusieurs États ont été sanctionnés parce qu'on leur a imposé des lois sociales. S'ils ne les adaptaient pas, on les sanctionnait. Jusqu'à la Banque mondiale. On connaît l'exemple de l'Ouganda et là, et d'autres pays. On leur met la pression parce qu'ils doivent changer leur législation sur les soi-disant libertés. Donc voilà le type de choses qu'il faut enlever de notre partenariat. En ce moment, nous pourrons bâtir vraiment quelque chose de positif, que ce soit avec l'Occident, avec la Chine ou avec n'importe quel autre partenaire. Moi, je vois comme ça l'avenir de l'Afrique. Mais pas en antagonisme, pas adhérer forcément au BRICS+. Certes, c'est important, c'est un groupe de pression, mais sans rejeter aussi forcément l'Occident. Mais il faut qu'on modifie nos rapports avec l'Occident pour pouvoir tirer le meilleur profil pour toutes les parties. Je vous remercie.
Merci beaucoup. Merci beaucoup. Est-ce que il y a une question de un des deux côtés ou de chaque côté du débat? Does one or the other or both sides of this debate have a question?
Plutôt qu'une question, moi je voudrais remercier le président Macky Sall parce que quelque part il l'a pas dit comme ça, mais il s'est aligné avec cette partie de la discussion parce qu'il a dit clairement deux choses. J'ai écouté très attentivement. D'abord, il parle de l'Occident. Ça c'est bien. Il ne faut pas choisir. Il nous faut tous les partenaires et il nous faut les partenaires en bonne santé. Allez, je mets ces petites en bonne santé, même si vous ne l'avez pas dit. Mais j'ai cru comprendre que la stabilité de l'Occident, c'est plutôt une bonne nouvelle de votre point de vue. Et l'autre, c'est quelque chose sur lequel nous avons beaucoup insisté, qui est que c'est clair que le système international est cassé, il faut le réformer, mais que c'est mieux d'avoir un système réformé et le réformer que de ne pas l'avoir. Donc, merci beaucoup, Monsieur le Président.
Well, I thought it was only Bright that was confusing his name with his wish. Apparently, we have a second. What President Macky Sall said, the way I understood it, is very, very different. What he was basically saying is that we are not after just vote and representation. We are about changing the way things work. And the way things work, I'm sorry, is not the system that we know, because this is a Western-centered system that is collapsing. So the break, what President Sall is saying, is an opportunity for Africa to seek and make understand that we need everybody at the table, not just one or the other, which means that the break or no break is not our business. Our business is to use that break for the better.
Fantastic. It's good to see both sides are claiming President Macky Sall. Merci beaucoup pour votre intervention. I'd like to pivot now and head east to Jin Yong Kai, who started his career in finance, went through various institutions, Goldman Sachs, Morgan Stanley, I think, also a CEO of the IFC, has some relationship with Mo Ibrahim. I think you're on the board of the foundation, and has quite an interesting view of this whole debate. Maybe we could start with what's happening in Hong Kong, which has, opened up, the export agency has opened up a couple of representative agencies 18 months ago, one in Kenya, one in Egypt, maybe a sign of a changing Chinese relationship or desire of a changed Chinese relationship with the continent. Tell us a little bit about how you're seeing the debate, and then the panel can ask, each side can ask a question.
Thank you. I think the debate, I think we talk about almost like black and white. I think we got to analyze what happened, right? I don't believe the total collapse of West is good for everybody. We need order. And in spite of the narrative provided by New York Times and all the Western media, as if China trying to compete, trying to win this battle, which is not true. China want to have a healthy relationship with US, with Europe. And we need to jointly create a better world. I think if you can, you look at President Xi has been emphasizing instead even today, what is the principle between China and the United States? Three things: mutual respect, peaceful coexistence, win-win collaboration. That's in spite of the US trying to kill China on technology, anything you can imagine, but we view this as a temporary. We do believe eventually, hopefully there's no hot war. We're going to settle for a new paradigm. I think the paradigm, I agree with President Macky Sall. We need to figure out a way how to deal with so-called global public goods issue. But as far as Africa concerned, I think we can debate about all these other things. We need to focus on the basic things, which is jobs. Without creating jobs, everything else is all hot air. We can debate winning, who is losing. What is the key on job creation? Absolutely, for Africa, energy has been my passion. President Macky Sall touched upon the most fundamental issue. Without electricity, we're not going to be in the modern world. We can't compete. Let's focus on that and work with European partners, work with the Chinese. I will tell you one thing is very interesting is, in my job in IFC right now, I'm trying to do infrastructure emerging markets. There are plenty willing partners, including President Xi. I met him a couple of times. He keeps saying, let's do something together with the US, with Europe for Africa energy. So my view on this is talk about Hong Kong. Hong Kong is interesting, trying to make a transition from very focused on mainland China, but focusing on global as a channel for financing. But fundamentally, I think we need to figure out a way to make financing of infrastructure in Africa as the #1 priority. When you make that happen, use that as a guiding principle to seek partnership. I don't believe the European partners or US, there are a lot of good companies in the US. We need to create a condition for them to come to Africa to fix the gaps we have on infrastructure. And then gradually we are going to build a kind of a value-added economy and create the income. That's really the only way I think we can, can move on. Rather than looking backward, we need to look forward. So that's all my contribution, I can say.
Thank you very much. Are there comments or questions from either side of the panel?
What he's just said about, win-win and all this stuff. Is that a problem?
Certainly, like every astute observer on the front lines, he completely agrees with us. Because he talks about order being the central component of a world in which Africa has the peace of mind to strategize and to engage. A world in which we are facing chaos on every front, and Africa, therefore, has to constantly be on the edge. It's not a world that allows us room to really operate at the kind of strategic level that benefits us in the long run. I think that's the point he's making. The point he's making is that order is relatively important. This idea of constant competition, which is being introduced without a focus on collaboration, will not work. And the current model of the breakdown of the Western system is not one in which collaboration is the path forward. That's a key argument. A cage meant that it is one of with dog eat dog, unbridled capitalist competition, and a re-intensification of realpolitik. And that kind of world is really dangerous. And if we're going to enter into that kind of world, we have to do so with our eyes wide open. I think that's exactly the point that he's making. And the better we focus on collaboration, rethink the zero-sum game, the better for the world.
I think I just have one question that's been running through my mind in this argument. Why must this order come from the West? Because it feels like we still have to be contingent on it. The constant question that I think you both asked is, what is Africa waiting for? And if Africa can actually create a sense of order for itself and then use that as a leverage, then why must we wait for the more geopolitically chaotic order of the West as it is now?
No, but I think we have a problem here. It's not that order comes from the West, it's that disorder comes from the breakup of the West. Huge disorder.
Yeah, because they were the biggest stakeholders of that so-called order. So now that they're falling apart, we have to rethink, where do we then have a sense of order and certainty? That requires a lot of internal reflection, or am I?
I thought the disorder was coming from the US administration.
That.
The Oval Office.
We're at a huge danger of agreeing too much with each other. I have the benefit of being able to call on generations even younger than our own, which is pretty astonishing. Frederick Omondi, you're with Kenya's Ministry of the Interior. Kenya's had its own interesting relationship with navigating the sort of the changing international order. I think the Ruto administration got quite close to some of Biden's priorities, sent a security force to the island of Haiti, for example, and has found in Trump a far less easy character to deal with. From your perspective, from this debate, but also particularly on Kenya, where are you coming from?
Thank you very much. Allow me not to speak on behalf of the Kenyan government. These are my own opinions. On behalf of the millennials and the Gen Zs of this of the African origin, from Haiti to Papua New Guinea, from Morocco to Cape Town, the thing is, we are tired of this curse of unemployment. We are tired of this curse of poverty. We are tired of this curse of poor infrastructure, of ill health. Why is it always Africa? And after proper observation and analysis, we came to the realization that for all these problems to be solved, one thing seems to be the common factor, and that is money. Money is very important for us to solve most of these our problems. But then again, money is an artificial creation. It's not a natural thing. Somebody somewhere sat somewhere to come up with this concept called money. Before the colonial era, Africa largely did not have this concept called money or currency. It's a creation of the foreigners who came in. They are the ones who create money. They are the ones who distribute money. They are the ones who value money. When I talk of value, I'm talking about valuation. We have different currencies, and these currencies have different values. Africa plays zero role in the